I'm joined today by Abby Schachter, who is author of No Child Left Alone, Getting Government Out of Parenting. Abby, it's great to talk to you. I've looked at the book extensively, and I'm very, very interested in a lot of the sort of examples that you tell in the book about what you consider to be sort of extreme government overreach into parenting. But I'd like to start a little more broadly, which is what's sort of the larger statement you're trying to make about the government's role in parenting in the United States?
Well, the first statement I want to make is that the government has taken on a huge role in parenting. I think raising awareness of the problem would be my first goal. And then beyond that, I would say the problem with that isn't just a matter of where parents may differ from government prescriptions, but also that the government tends to do things very broadly by definition, and that tends to make it a poor problem solver in many cases, because some of the problems or issues that they're trying to solve are much more complicated than can be legislated, I would say. And then also there's cost, there's inefficiencies, and then the overarching sort of, I would say, there's no reason in many of these cases for the government to have an opinion in many areas, and we just tend to accept that it does. And I'm hoping that that'll slowly change with greater awareness of the problem.
So are you coming at this from, I mean, in being familiar with your other work, I would want to first ask, do you generally consider yourself like a small government conservative? Is that your general approach? The government should not do anything that is not absolutely necessary, so to speak?
No, because I think that would be a really unachievable goal at this point. So I'm a libertarian, and broadly speaking, in terms of domestic policy, and I embrace the idea that Americans should be trusted to run their own lives in as many cases as possible.
So what about with cases of, for example, child abuse? I mean, certainly there are parents who say, listen, if I believe that my child is going to do best in the world, if I bring him or her up with spankings, and maybe the spankings are an open hand, or maybe the spankings are a closed hand, or maybe they're a stick, or maybe they're an iron or something like that, is it
Right.
fair in your mind for the government to say, above and beyond our sort of general laws about what constitutes a physical assault in public, that we're going
Right.
to establish some guidelines for what physically is allowed to parents to do to their kids? Are you okay with that conceptually?
Absolutely. And in fact, there was a recent case in Massachusetts that was exactly this type of thing. A man had disciplined his daughter with an open hand. He had physically hit her in public, and he was charged as a result of this assault, essentially. And the state, it went to the state courts, and they ruled in the father's favor, basically defining his right to discipline his child with an open hand. One of the problems that I encountered doing the research for this book is, if all the that over time, many definitions of care for children have been expanded. So the word abuse, the word neglect, the word endangerment, these are terms that have come to mean a much broader series of possible circumstances than they were originally. And
Okay, but let's pause
I
on that
think,
because I
yeah,
want to be, I'm hearing what you're saying, and what I'm hearing is big picture, you are okay with the government taking some positions and getting involved in certain areas of what a parent may or may not do with relation to their child. So once you accept that, we're really dealing in shades of gray, right? And now it comes down to what specifically do you or don't you think is okay and the definition. So once we get
I
into a
would,
discussion of shades of gray, then who should enforce those shades of gray? Who should decide on them in your mind, given that you've
right.
accepted some legislation is okay?
Well, listen, I think that I accept the Supreme Court's definition of the rights of parents to have authority and discretion over their children. The exception that the Supreme Court made, and this was 100 years ago, basically, was that parents are responsible for educating their children. I think that is a terrific standard, right? So if you want to argue that if it makes you more comfortable to say we're talking about shades of gray, I would say we have to start from the understanding that we're not talking about a situation where it's sort of the middle piece that we're discussing. It's really a pendulum that has swung very, very far in the direction of government oversight. And it's going to take a lot of work by many, many people to push the needle back to a situation where we would get to a point of saying it's just these sort of nuances where we need to define terms. I
Yeah, the
think
problem I
if
have with
you,
that argument, though, Abby, is
yeah,
what you're basically saying is, okay, we are sort of, what you say, if I'm more comfortable saying we're talking of in shades of gray. I think you've confirmed we are talking about shades of gray, but your concern is more with the instances sort of at the extremes, and you outline some of them in your book. The problem I have with that general principle, which is
right.
the big problem is with what's on the fringes, is that many libertarians, and I'm not accusing you of this, but I'd be open to hearing your view about it, when they talk about gun control, they say we actually should not be worried about what's going on the fringes, right? All of the negligent incidents that happen based on what we have as generally pretty permissive gun laws. They want to focus on the fact that mostly it's okay. And it seems sort of like the opposite principle.
Okay, well, since my subject isn't gun control, I'm gonna take what you're saying and put it to my argument about parenting.
Yeah, or I
And I
guess let
would
me
say that,
rephrase it in a way that maybe makes it more in your wheelhouse, which is, as a general rule, when you look at law and the government, do you always focus merely on these fringe cases?
right, well, so the interesting thing about that is that the government is the one doing that in terms of parenting decisions. So if you look at the National School Lunch Program, right? The National School Lunch Program is based on a model that there is a minority of kids who may be at risk for becoming obese. And as a result, we're going to impose that extreme minority possibility and risk, or that, even if it wasn't an extreme, that minority possibility on everyone. And that's where I have the problem. I think it's actually the government that is most often taking the minority and extreme cases and saying, because we don't want that to happen, we're going to impose that the exception and make the exception the rule.
So like for example, and I'm trying to really find what analogies there are to see if we have sort of a consistent principle with the
Right.
issue of transgender bathroom policy. When
Okay.
there's a presentation made that says, hey, really people, in the interest of not creating more laws and restrictions, let people use the bathroom for the gender identity that matches up with them. You have some, typically on the political right, who say, no, there's child predators who might take advantage of these laws, or et cetera. Those are definitely the fringes. I mean, it is almost completely unheard of.
Totally.
You would be completely
Yes.
against using that line of reasoning to restrict bathroom usage, for example.
Yes. So my answer to that would be, why is the government involved in private enterprises and the signs they put on their bathrooms?
All right.
If the government wants to make sure that in in the federal office buildings or in state office buildings, they changed the signs on their bathroom doors so that legislators are going into, and aides are all the people who work for, in a public institution are going into a bathroom that says, bathroom with urinal, bathroom without urinal. I don't, okay, great. Make the sign however you want it. But why is the government telling private enterprises the kind of signs on the bathrooms they have to provide? This is exactly the area where I would say it's none of the government's business to impose its view about transgendered Americans on private enterprises.
All right, good. Well, we agree there. In the limited time we have left, to go back to the school lunch example, are you
Okay.
okay? I mean, to some extent, you must grant that schools do have to make decisions about what's available for lunch, right? I mean, on that, someone has to, they
Absolutely.
have to make some decision. And if you are okay with that, then again, it sounds like what we're talking about is you don't believe the specifics they've chosen make sense. So it's really a matter just of people coming together and saying, what particulars make sense. It's not really an argument saying schools shouldn't have any authority over what lunch is served. And then again, we are talking about shades of gray, are we not?
Yes, and I would say in that case, 100%, David. And I would say the response I would give to that is you are 100% right. It's the schools who should be deciding what they serve in their cafeterias, not the states, not the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is the organization and the arm of the government that does decide and does set the nutritional guidelines for the entire country. And the USDA has a lot of other considerations it's making besides the nutritional health of students, of children in America. And by the way, they got it wrong about butter for 30 years. The government has gotten it wrong about just butter. So let schools, let the people who are actually going to feed the children these lunches decide what to feed them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
I
not
mean,
against that. Like with many libertarian influenced ideas, I'm not against
right.
what you're saying in the abstract. The problem is knowing what
Okay.
goes on in many specific school districts. A lot of
Ah,
them just don't have the right people there to actually make good decisions for the kids, and that becomes more of a logistical issue than the ideological issue that you're talking about.
well, I don't have I don't disagree with that, except that I would say, why would you assume that someone sitting in an office in Washington
Sure.
has a better sense of how to make lunch for a kid in middle school in Portland, Oregon, than a person who is in Oregon,
No, that
right?
it's
Or
a
a
fair
person who is
question.
in
The
Portland.
person in
So
Washington,
that's my
the
problem
person in
there. My problem
Washington,
there is that,
the person in Washington might
right?
not necessarily know more than the person in Portland, but in many cases they probably do, and that's why this is difficult, because the general point is the person in Washington won't always make the decision that's better for the person in Portland. And really, for me, the question is, pragmatically speaking, how do we ensure that for the school districts that really don't have anyone who's well qualified to make decisions about lunches, how do we make sure that the kids in those school districts are still having healthy options? And this becomes more an issue of bureaucracy and logistics than anything else.
Well, I do also, I would just disagree in one aspect, and
Okay.
that is you're essentially saying that you don't trust other people
Well, you're saying the same
unless
thing. You
they
don't
are
you don't trust the
government
person in
employees.
Washington, and I don't trust the fact that every school district might not have a nutritionist on staff.
Right. And
But
so
both of us have distrust.
I would say to you, like, so my question would be, given the cost and given the inefficiencies and given the fact that we have the situation that we have now, where there are schools that are actually suffering because of the demands of the federal government, and it's costing them money, and it's making their lives more difficult rather than simpler. Aren't the odds of bringing the solution to the particular problem closer to the people it will affect, and therefore give the people it affects more of a possibility of accountability, right? If I have to go to my cafeteria lady, right? I'm a mom of school children and I hate what they're serving in my school cafeteria.
Yeah.
I'm likely to have a better chance of getting better food in my kid's school if the lunch lady who's serving it is in charge of the decision of what to serve rather than somebody who's 3,000 miles away.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it depends on the lunch lady, but again, I think that might have to be an argument for another time. Abby
Well, and
Schachter,
also, David, I make my kids lunches, so I'm clearly not trusting, the hot lunch that's provided at my kids' school
right.
either.
Well, it's great that you can do that. Not all parents are in that position. The book is No Child Left Alone, Getting Government Out of Parenting. I get we did agree on some things, and I think that anytime I interview a libertarian, that we have to chalk it up to a victory, you know?
Listen, I appreciate the fact that you wanted to do the interview in the first place, so kudos.
All right. Thank you so much for being on.